Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our November 10th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. Both trade and beef markets have been making headlines in recent weeks, and today we'll dive into both topics with Iowa Farm Bureau President Brent Johnson and Kansas State University Ag Economics Professor Dr. Glynn Tonsor. We'll start with President Brent Johnson, who sat down with spokesman editor Tom Block in late October to discuss the trade conversations he and other Iowa Farm Bureau leaders have been initiating in Washington, D.C. and across the globe.
Brent, you took part in a trade mission to India earlier this fall with Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds as well as Secretary of Agriculture Mike Naig. I think that was following up on a trade mission you had taken a year earlier. So what's the history of that, the goal of that trade mission, and what were some of your key takeaways from that trip?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely accurate. You know, that really started probably a couple years ago. The governor and the secretary and myself, we started planning some of these trips, and India quickly showed up as a good target. First of all, the population of India is absolutely huge. They are today the world's largest country. They surpassed China about a year ago. They are the largest democracy. And there's also an emerging middle class. And we've learned through a long period of time that when a country has a population of middle class emergence, those people all of a sudden have just a little bit of disposable income. And one of the first things they want to do is they want to eat just a little bit better. You know, how can I go from rice to chicken or chicken to pork or pork to beef, that kind of thing. And so to gain some density in their food and some higher quality proteins is one of those effects of an emerging middle class. And India is certainly in that conversation. Also, how do they service and supply their entire population when it comes to what it takes to feed, clothe, house, 1.4, 1.5 billion people? I mean, that's a monstrous task. And so here we are in one of the most productive states in the United States. You know, our Iowa farmers are absolutely world-class, top-notch, best in what we do in anywhere. And so how do we find a home for the commodities and the services that this state is so good at? And so when we have those conversations with the governor and with the secretary and others, that's really where we try to focus on. So we went to India a year ago and learned a tremendous amount. Had a really good visit, and it really set the stage for a follow-up visit. And so then after we came back, we all sat around and digested our information and compared notes, and very quickly decided that we needed to go back and follow through with a second visit. And so planning started, and the governor asked that I attend with her on the similar follow-up trip, which we just got back from just a few weeks ago. And it was a very interesting trip this time. Number one, we'd been there before in a year ago, so we had a little bit of foundation that we could build on. So we didn't have to learn from scratch. We didn't have to experience those things for the first time, wherever it is that you go somewhere new. So we had some known quantities about the trip. And so it allowed us to ask some deeper questions and probe a little harder and figure out where are some more realistic opportunities? Are there missed opportunities from the first time? And what could be a follow-up plan? So this trip was very interesting. It was very appropriate, in my opinion, to have a follow-up trip like that with a country like India. And we'll see where those opportunities end up showing up and where we can capitalize in the future. But when we were there, we covered a lot of territory. We saw a lot of things. One of the highlights, we actually signed a sister state agreement with the state of Maharashtra. And it was one of the first sister states agreements that Maharashtra has ever signed. And so for a state like Iowa to do that with one of India's agriculture states was really one of those moments that was very, very important. Now, Iowa, we've got 3 million people, but Maharashtra has 300 million people. So here we are signing in a sister state agreement with somebody who's 100 times bigger than ourselves and the size of our country. But they are a leading ag producing state for India as well. We visited a dairy farm. We talked with locals. We talked business. We talked with consumer groups and, trying to find those opportunities that might have a role in future explorations.
Yeah, it sounds like really building relationships, because these countries want to have relationships with the people that they're going to be importing from. And this really gets the United States and Iowa specifically in on the ground floor.
For sure. And, we heard several times that there's a lot of people that are courting India, if you will. And it was made very clear that they are self-protectionist in some way. They want to do things themselves. And, I think being an Iowa farmer, we can fully understand and complement that attitude of trying to be self-reliant. But the reality is they do want to do that, but they're also going to have to satisfy their population as that country continues to grow. And as I said earlier, they're courting other countries, but I heard multiple times that they are very interested in the United States because even though they want to be independent, they feel like they can have the best partner, make the most money, partnered up with a country like the United States. And so with a country with the population of farmers and agriculture base that India has, it just makes a lot of sense that Iowa is a part of that conversation.
And it's not just India where you've been working and having these discussions. Over the next few weeks, several Iowa Farm Bureau board members will be part of other trade missions. So what markets will they be visiting, and what are the goals of these types of visits?
Through the last handful of years, I've been somewhat frustrated at some of the trade conversations that our country's had. The Trump administration, the first time around, was trying to right-size some relationships, and that ended up in some tariff conversations and some trade disruptions that weren't normal for that day. But it was probably needed to be done, but it was painful going through that. And then President Biden ended up being elected. So then through that disruption of Trump's first terms, the Biden administration really had no trade conversations happening whatsoever. So we're leaving a disruptive phase, heading into a very unproductive phase when it comes to trade. And in a state like Iowa and a country like the United States, we are truly dependent on trade because, like I said earlier, our farmers are literally the best in the world at what they do. And so to add value to those products, we have to have those sold across our borders. And so, that frustration of a trade disruption under one administration followed up by no trade conversations in the next administration. And here we are in Trump's second administration, and we continue to have trade disruptions as President Trump's vision through these conversations. And it is disruptive. It is painful. There are many stories of farmers having a hard time, young farmers specifically, many times livestock farmers. How are we going to find homes for that? And so through all of these conversations, I've been frustrated, but not satisfied with just being frustrated. What can we actually do about that? And so, I've really embraced the idea of going and visiting other countries and exploring opportunities, signing MOUs where we can, and doing what we can from a ground-based system to get our hands dirty and to find opportunities to make partnerships so that when those opportunities show up in the future and we get the national picture figured out, that we've laid some decent groundwork and some foundation so that we can hit the ground running and know that we've got some of those partnerships pre-built, if you will. And so, we've been to a lot of countries over the last few years. We just talked about India. In the next couple weeks, 2 of our board members are going to go over to Vietnam and Indonesia. Another board member who's headed to Chicago in a couple weeks to have a roundtable discussion with the United States and China forum and roundtable situation. That should be very interesting. And then I'm headed over to the UK in mid-November as well with the British Embassy and some state secretaries of agriculture to learn a little bit more about the UK's animal health sectors and our trade opportunities and putting a little more depth into the UK framework that was signed earlier this year. So being frustrated is one thing, doing something about it is another, and hopefully hopefully this organization is leading by example when it comes to figuring out what that looks like in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And you do see a lot of discussion of what's happening in the media, and we've seen the powerful impact that certain statements can have on markets. The cattle situation recently with President Trump's comments on high beef prices at the grocery store and possibly increasing imports. The situation that's been ongoing with China and U.S. soybeans. So how is Farm Bureau making its voice heard on these specific issues here at the highest levels?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's very important for people to understand is that these conversations, whether they're tweets or public meetings, comments on airplanes, whatever they are, they're real and they do reverberate quite strongly down on the country and the farm level. And so when those things happen, and we've heard them before, we're likely to hear them again as history often repeats itself. Whether it's soybean farmers or cattle farmers, our members need to understand that this organization, the Iowa Farm Bureau, American Farm Bureau, we are speaking, and we are speaking loudly. Sometimes that's a public statement. Sometimes that's not so public. Many times you're going to see a balancing act of, you're going to read a statement from the Iowa Farm Bureau. We put one out, I think, worded properly for the cattle situation not too many weeks ago. It really talked to the sensitivity of the administration to the profitability of production agriculture, and in this case, production in the cattle sector. But ultimately, every single time I have a conversation with Secretary Rollins, the word I use with her every single time is profitability. So she knows exactly where the Iowa Farm Bureau is at. She knows exactly what I'm going to tell her, at least in some aspects, when we do have our conversations. Rest assured that, we have had direct conversations with Secretary Rollins, with President Trump, and they fully understand where we're at, and they know where we don't agree. They know where we align. And so farmers' voices are being heard, even if the farmers don't hear their voices being heard. That message is being carried forward very strongly and very clearly, and probably very appropriately based on the opportunity and the audience that's listening.
Yeah, that's an important message. And as you mentioned, the grassroots strength of Farm Bureau and all those farmers out there, but then leading up through the Iowa Farm Bureau and the American Farm Bureau, as a member of the American Farm Bureau Board of Directors, you had an opportunity to have a meeting with the U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer here not too many weeks ago. What did Ambassador Greer have to say, and what was your takeaways from his meeting with the board?
I found him to be one of the most down-to-earth, genuine individuals that holds a significant role in the administration. He's just like you and me. I mean, we could have a conversation and we could talk in clear terms and understand what we're talking about. I didn't get the sense by any means that he was covering his tracks or being careful about what was being said. He had a very clear direction as to what he was trying to get accomplished when it comes to all these trade conversations. And he said very clearly that all of these trade conversations with individual countries, whichever country it is, we want to ratchet our trade forward with those countries. And every single conversation includes an agriculture aspect to it. And I found him to be very genuine, and I believe him, and I believe him at his word. And so he also understands the concept of profitability. He understands what this country is good at, and he understands what this country needs for its producers to remain in business, to be viable not only today, but tomorrow as well. And I found him extremely genuine, has a direct ear to the president. He told a nice little story where, he's meeting with the prime minister of a country, and the president wanted to talk to that prime minister, asked to talk to him through his cell phone. And so Ambassador Greer was meeting with this prime minister, and he called the president directly. And the president had a conversation with that prime minister for about 20 minutes with Ambassador Greer's cell phone. And when they were done, the prime minister of that country looked at his cabinet members and said, do whatever he wants.
Wow.
To have somebody in those conversations, in those seats, that can have the ear and the voice of the president directly delivered to countries' leadership, but also has an understanding of agriculture, has an understanding of what it takes out here to have dirty boots and know what we need to move forward. Jameson Greer is doing a fantastic job, in my opinion.
Very good to hear. As you mentioned earlier, there's hard times out there in the country. We've had hard times before, but It sounds like it's hopeful that we've had the history with disruption and then an agreement and markets opened up. And is that the path we're headed on now?
I certainly think so. To be quite honest about it, it's been very frustrating to throw all the traditional agreements away, if you will, or certainly disrupt them and to start over, scrap them all and move forward. It's frustrating. It's scary. It's confusing to try to follow this administration through these conversations. But, President Trump, he's a New York businessman, and that methodology does not necessarily make logical sense to a Midwest farmer. We just think differently when it comes to those things. And President Trump is the epitome of a businessman. There's no question about it. So then to have some trust, to follow through what looks like a mess, I think for the most part, American Midwest farmers are understanding that. Now, with that said, I have had conversations with Secretary Rowlands and let her know that tolerance is running out. It's running out not only in patience, but it's also running out in farmers' ability to do business next year. This is very disruptive. Corn and soybeans, we are not profitable. Many segments are not profitable, and we can only sustain that for so long. So there's been a lot of capital eroded over the last couple of years. That message has been delivered. It continues to be delivered, which is why I continue to beat the drum of profitability when I talk to Secretary Rowlands. Now, in parallel with that, she's also been told that the tolerance in the farming sector is growing thin for some of these. We need some of these trade agreements to show up, to get finalized, to ratchet our trade agreements forward so that we can find some solid, consistent homes for the products that we all grow so that we can see a pathway forward, and some of these things are going to make sense in the future.
Mm-hmm. And as we talk a lot about markets and trade, you mentioned profitability was a challenge this year. It's looking like a challenge next year. So on the input side, fertilizer prices, things like that, that's also a concern and things that are being looked at. But consolidation in the industry, trade, and making those input prices be at a reasonable, fair level.
For sure. And I was called just a couple days ago by the Senate Judiciary Committee. And it was kind of a fun conversation for me because it was a Zoom call. And I was in the combine seat, and their questions ended up being a lot of antitrust questions. What does the fertilizer market look like? What does the seed market look like? What does the equipment market look like when it comes to opportunities? And are those opportunities fully available, or are they being sequestered to some degree through consolidation? And do you have proper choice when it comes to selecting how you're going to grow, where you can buy your inputs from, et cetera, et cetera. We had a fantastic conversation. And to be able to do that from a Zoom call from my combine seat directly to the Senate Judiciary Committee, I think it made a statement to some degree that they call the farmer to have this conversation. And it just so happened that it was the background and the situation that it was. And I think it actually played out very well. But ultimately, the real message is that we need to make sure that, profitability, it's one thing to have the revenue side of your balance sheet show up as profitability. But the reality is, for the last 3 years, we've all been growing the most expensive crops that we've been growing. Every year makes a record as far as the expense of that crop going in. And so, as we increase our costs on the expense side of the balance sheet and we're reducing our revenues on the income side of the balance sheet, the net farm income in Iowa farmer across the board is about as low as it's been in about 15 years. That's just simply not acceptable. It's not sustainable. And it just shows the increased risk when you have to spend that much capital to try to lose as little money as possible. Something needs to change, and something needs to change pretty quickly.
Well, Brent, we're heading into harvest wrapping up. Let's give us an update on what you saw yield-wise and your progress.
I've had a lot of conversations throughout Iowa, throughout the Midwest, and what I heard similar stories in almost every conversation. Soybeans were very, very good. Maybe not the best I've ever grown, but certainly among the best I've ever grown. And corn had so much potential. We were having a different conversation in July and August. We were going to have a record by a long ways. We still had good yields, but the disease pressures were real. There's a lot of stories across the entire Midwest of heavy disease pressure, sequential fungicide applications, and the return on investments for each one of those applications was as extreme as I've ever seen. You spend a little bit of money and you got a huge return out of those. And so, every year is different. Who knows what the 2026 crop is going to show us. I learn something every year, and I just wish it would apply to the next year so I knew what was going on. But regardless, we had a good year. Look forward to the new opportunities that the new year brings.
Thanks, Brent. As U.S. agriculture sits at a critical crossroads, it's essential for farmers to share their own unique stories and advocate for the importance of trade, market competition, and more. As you just heard, Farm Bureau is right in the middle of those conversations and will continue to be as agriculture weathers today's economic challenges. Next up is Dr. Glynn Tonsor, an ag economist at Kansas State University, to offer us a clear-eyed look at beef markets. There's plenty of buzz about beef right now, but folks in agriculture know that the realities of today's U.S. beef markets have been years in the making. For expert insight into those beef markets, Dr. Tonsor visited with Spokesman reporter Corey Munson late last month.
Can you kind of go over briefly just what's the state of the beef industry as well as the cattle cycle right now?
Yeah, lots of discussion about whether or not we're going to start expanding the herd. Cattle prices are quite elevated compared to a year ago. And I'm trying to clarify to lots of folks, that's not just a supply story. I mean, there are supply realities and higher production costs that are part of that. But core to it is beef demand is quite strong. So the public is able and willing to pay more for beef today than we were expecting. And so they're pulling up the beef prices. Supply side things push up beef prices, but consumers are pulling them up. And I'm making that distinction. So prices are quite high. Profitability for most in the beef cattle industry, like here in the Midwest, is one of the sole positive spots in production ag at the moment. So that's more fun to talk about than some of the other ag sectors. But I'm really trying to impress on people there's a beef demand pull, not just a supply challenge.
So as I see it, there's kind of two factors here. There's the price on the shelf, but then calves are also way up there price-wise to get them into the feedlot. You mentioned the pull of the prices going up. What's driving the calf price?
Well, they're very much connected. So if the public is willing to pay more for any kind of beef item, ribeye, steak, ground beef, whatever at your grocery store, that sends what I would call the derived demand signal. So it is pulling up the box beef price, so wholesale beef, which in turn is pulling up the fed cattle price, so the value of animals leaving the feed yard, which is turn pulling up the feeder cattle and the calves, as you said. So I would argue they're very connected. Those are economic signals in a market. When we let the market work, those signals are there. Likewise, when we have fewer calves in our system, back to the supply part, that sends a signal the other direction. There's fewer pounds coming. So it's going to be more expensive. There's fewer pounds to go compete. And that shows up at the grocery store as well. So both directions, they're connected would be my response.
So given the size of the herd, what impact is that having on packers? And are we seeing the threat of possibly losing some plants because of this?
So yes, but I will deal with the packing one in just a second. But the number of cows is where the supply story starts, but doesn't end. So it's the number of hooves in the system, right? So the number of mama cows gives us an indication of the calf crop, like how many from their offspring are in our production system. And that is definitely down from a head count, number of hooves perspective. But something I have impressed on folks is that does not mean that beef availability has declined. And there's individual years it has, but actually there's a long-term trend in the increase in what we produce in this country. At the same time, there's a long-term decline in the number of cows. That's because we're more efficient. So breeding success, weaning success, less death loss, more weight while they're in the feed yard. Add all that up is we're getting more weight sellable to consumers in edible form per mama cow in the system than ever before. And that's an awesome efficiency story. We used to use the term sustainability in that, and it still applies. But that's an important reminder because it's not just number of cows. Like the story starts there, but there's more to that. Now, the reality in the packing space, to your question, is the number of hooves is very important because it's like my physical capacity. How many animals could I run in a day relative to how many are available for me to buy and process? And the bigger that differential, so the fewer animals there are relative to what I want to run through the plant, the more margin pressure we have on that sector. And the packing sector is feeling that for sure. And it's probably going to feel that more for the next couple of years because the number of animals coming at that sector pretty much can't grow the next 2 years. You got to pull the trigger on expansion. And actually, ironically, when you do that, it makes the issue worse initially because those are heifers that aren't showing up. You're waiting for their offspring, and future years of their offspring will be part of that story. So that challenge you're alluding to, it's here now, but it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
So let's maybe talk a little bit about trade then. How does issues of demand for overseas as well as, potential imports to the U.S., how does this affect prices?
Yeah, so when I try to clarify the role of trade is we have live animal trade and we have meat trade. So the live animal trade would be mainly Mexico and Canada with the U.S. when it comes to cattle.
Sure.
But when it comes to beef trade, it's a global, much more, it's not just North America. And we historically export products that have a higher value abroad than at home. And I often use tongues as my example, but you use tongues, you use livers, you use various products that historically are worth much more in a foreign country than they are domestically. And that's the role of a market, right? Is if they value more, they quote unquote bid them and they win them, right? Well over 90% of the livers, for example, historically are exported. At the end of the day, the total demand for U.S. beef items comes from exports, domestic grocery store retail for at home, and domestic food service for away from home. Those are three distinct channels. My tongue example is historically exported. The highest value ribeye type items tend to go through a food service, think a Ruth Chris type outlet, right? And then lots of ground beef items are more common to be like through the grocery store, right? And there's blendings of lots of other beef items, but what I'm trying to impress on your listeners here is the markets are distinct to those three. Exports serve a different role because they're different products than are through our domestic market. And it's the summation of the demand from those three channels that shows up in supporting or depressing, if it's a bad demand environment, cattle prices.
Broadly, in a multi-year process, are we expanding our beef sales overseas? Is that contracting as well? Where are we at?
That ebbs and flows. If we're producing less at home, there's less available to export. It sort of starts that way. But the foreign demand for U.S. beef has been pretty good over the last 20 years. The cow that stole Christmas in 2003 was kind of a low point in that discussion, but a long-term trend since then has been growing foreign demand for U.S. beef. Yes, there's individual years and hiccups in that, but in general, it's growing. And I would argue that's a reflection on globally, the U.S. beef system has a comparative advantage, very similar to Canada, but besides Canada, basically the only place in the world where there's a large volume of grain finished, highly marbled, high-quality beef that's different than most suppliers around the world. And that has a lot to do with our export presence. The flip of that is on the import side. So when we talk trade, we got to talk both exports and imports. And the U.S. is a major producer and a major exporter and a major importer of beef. And people get confused by that because they how can it be both? Well, it's because beef isn't beef. We don't import things like tongues. We just export them. We import a high volume of highly lean items that we blend with our trimmings, our less lean items that are produced here out of our feed yard system to produce ground beef. So beef isn't beef is what I'm trying to impress on you. It's different by market channel, and the role of beef in our export system is different than the role of beef in our import system, but they work together because they're different products, and that could be confusing. I understand that, but we need to recognize they both have a role in supporting the broader beef cattle industry.
So when we talk about rebuilding of the herd nationally here in the U.S., what indicators should we be watching for going forward that may tell us, yeah, we're finally at the bottom of the cycle, we're looking at maybe walking up that hill?
So the two reports I historically watch the most, so beyond anecdotal stuff, which is fine, but data's better than anecdotal stories, is the cattle on feed report, which typically comes out every month. We're talking in the midst of a shutdown, so to be determined if we get the next report. We watch for the steer-heifer split in that report. So every third one of those reports, USDA historically tells us the gender split. And if the percentage that's being placed is more heifers than normal, I know those heifers are not staying home on the farm. They're coming to the feed yard, so we're not expanding. If the percentage heifers is going down at placement, well, they're somewhere. They're likely on the ranch. It's a clear indicator to me that we're expanding. Similarly, the January and July cattle inventory reports that, again, USDA typically puts out, they tell us at the state level the number of heifers that are being held back. So we have a state by state and then aggregated up to the national level. Those are the two must-see reports to your question.
Has this cycle cost us farmers, ranchers, farms and ranches? I mean, are we losing guys because they can't afford to restock their herd?
That question is a tricky one because I don't want to make it too complicated, but the answer is there's some of both response. So we definitely have fewer mama cows in the system, and we have fewer operations in the system than we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. I'm not disputing that at all. But we also have very elevated beef demand that is creating an opportunity that has not been around for the beef cattle industry for some time. So both are true. If you are an operation who has average cost of production or lower, I could quickly make an argument things have never been better because you're well positioned to take advantage of that, and you're not the one that's sort of at risk of going out of business. But if you're one that has a higher cost of production in a fairly commoditized industry, it's not new that you've got profit pressures on your business that are like the reason that we have fewer operations over time. So both exist. The latest USDA numbers I saw is we might have something like 700,000 operations that have cows in the U.S. A lot of them are smaller. So the vast majority of them would have 50 cows or less. And there's a wide range in cost structure across those operations. That's always been the case. There's nothing new in that. So that long-term trend of if you're on the wrong side of cost production, it puts pressure on, like, can you still be in the business is not new. I'm not shying away from that. That's still the case and probably will forever be the case. The part that's a little new today that wasn't so much there 5 and certainly 15 years ago is the opportunity on the beef demand front, like to potentially meet the consumer with that and grow your operation. If you're doing that well, there's more opportunity and optimism on that than there used to be. So both trends are real is what I'm trying to impress on you. And it kind of depends who I'm talking with, which of those camps you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. But being fiscally sound and fiscally responsible, once again, more important than ever.
Correct. And you can't manage what you don't measure. So you got to know what your costs are to manage it. And likewise, I, as an analyst trying to help, I can't do it as well as I'm not getting the public data to tell me what it is too.
Going forward, do we have enough farms and ranches to provide both domestic and international markets?
So I'm from a hog farm in Missouri. I'm proud of that background. And on balance, U.S. ag has found a way to not only feed itself, but proverbially feed the world, right? Now, there's been notable growth in South America during my lifetime that, South America is a big part of feeding the world too. So to give credit there, but it is not new that we are more than food sufficient, right? There's individual commodities, maybe not, but in balance, that's still the case. But core to that is an environment of, the value of law and property rights and some things that are somewhat unique to the U.S. system that we probably shouldn't take for granted. But I would say that's the case here in 2025, just like it was back in, say, 1985.
Are there any issues or things coming on the horizon that you've seen that you think could prompt another black swan event completely out of the blue?
There's always concerns about animal health and disease. And the most recent discussion on that is the screwworm in Southern Plains. We're probably going to continue to talk about that, but I would impress on our listeners, that's not the only disease risk that exists. It's just the one that is in the headlines the most. So that is always there. But honestly, what probably matters more than just the physical aspect of that, like if it hits your herd, there's some physical outcomes, is the consumer demand response. So do we lose an export market because the market closes after an event? Actually is the more economically important decision in that. It's not the event, it's the market response to the event. That's what's really important. So that's a version of the black swan that might happen. Will it happen? How big will it be? I have no clue, but that is on my mind when you ask the question. The other one would be, we've been blessed, the industry, for some time now. Macroeconomic uncertainty is pretty elevated. So we're in a different trade environment and tariff environment and tax uncertainty, lots of things that are less certain than they used to be. And despite that, beef demand has been very strong. I don't know how long you can have elevated uncertainty and elevated beef demand. I've been pleasantly incorrect on that. I tell all audiences that for a couple of years now, but we should not take that for granted is the point. So that is a version of a black swan, is something that disrupts beef demand, definitely would be depressing for cattle prices and therefore margins in the industry.
There's a reason consumers continue to demand the high-quality beef being raised in Iowa and across this country. When it comes to meat quality, animal care, and sustainability, no one does it better than our cattle farmers. That's a hard-earned advantage that we need to protect. But as you just heard from Dr. Tonsor, the market realities facing our beef farmers do vary significantly from region to region. If that's something you're interested in learning more about, we actually have a unique learning opportunity for you coming up next spring. From March 9th through 12th, Iowa Farm Bureau will be hosting a market study tour in the heart of Texas cattle country. Iowa farmers who participate in this exclusive market study tour will explore how federal and state agencies are navigating threats to livestock health, trade dynamics, and how record prices and low cattle herd numbers impact and shape the cattle supply chain. To learn more about that market study tour and apply before the December 14th, 2025 deadline, use the link we provided down in the notes for this podcast episode. And while you're down in the podcast notes, I'd encourage you to check out a few of the other upcoming events we are hosting for Iowa's farmers, including Iowa Farm Bureau's annual meeting and county leadership conference, which will be held December 9th and 10th in Des Moines, a free webinar to help you prepare your 2025 farm income taxes on November 21st, and a handful of our Take Root Farm Succession Planning workshops, which will be held at numerous locations across the state this winter. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you picked up some helpful information and that you'll join us for our next episode on November 24th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.